Thank you, madam, for the introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, thank you. First, I'd like to thank IMA Deshingnad for this opportunity. As you all know, last week the government did come out with its guidelines on how to start post-COVID clinics and also the importance of the need for starting these post-COVID clinics. So, I'm. Is the slide visible?
Yeah, visible.
Slide?
Visible.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I will straight away go to the topic proper. So initially, this post-acute COVID-19 syndrome used to be termed as long COVID. It was actually termed by a patient who had this had a long recovery from acute COVID-19 syndrome. And after that, the term like post-acute COVID-19 syndrome, chronic COVID-19, etc., has been coined. We know that following recovery from majority of the viral fevers, even our dengue. So in case of severe dengue and all, it may take say weeks to months for certain people to come back to normalcy. Okay, and majority of them will be having this fatigability and excessive hair loss and all those stuff. And like that in COVID also we are observing the same things, and along with that certain unique manifestations are being observed in the post or the convalescent period in COVID-19. And WHO has now recognized that some of the patients do have these lingering symptoms or long-term effects of COVID-19, and these are the the definitions. The post-acute COVID-19 or the long COVID is a multi-system disease, sometimes occurring even after a relatively mild acute illness. And post-acute COVID-19 is defined as manifestations extending beyond 3 weeks, that is 21 days from the onset of first symptoms, and chronic COVID-19 is extending beyond 12 weeks. So what percentage of patients are likely to have this acute post-COVID syndrome? Studies show that around 10% will have symptoms persisting for more than 21 days, and around 2% of individuals may have these symptoms persisting more than 3 months. Okay, so some studies show that around 75% and all. That depends on basically Sandhya madam said that the Italian study showed that around 80% had problems. That depends on the inclusion criteria. So in majority of the European countries and all, only the hypoxemic patients do get admitted to the hospitals. And if these studies are done on hypoxemic, probably 80% will be having the post-COVID syndrome. So in Kerala and all, the situation is different, and we used to admit almost all the patients. It is only say for last 2 months or so that we are allowing patients to be in home quarantine or home isolation. So if you are considering only the hypoxemic patients who are getting admitted, so the percentage may be as high as 75 to 80%. Now, what is the pathophysiology of this post-COVID syndrome? We know the myriad multi-system manifestations are postulated to be due to persistent low-level inflammation or relapsing inflammation due to a dysregulated immune response. And we need to be aware of this slide. So WHO and initially we used to say that 100 years around 85% will be illness and 15% to severe disease, and 5% will become critically ill. So in the Kerala scenario, the situation is much better. And we know that around 4% will progress to severe disease, and maybe around say 1.5% will become critically ill. So one important aspect, if you are going through this slide, is from WHO, the time taken for recovery. So in mild illness, it may be around say 14 days, but for severe illness, it is around say 3 to 6 weeks for recovery. Okay, so we need to understand the extrapulmonary implications of this COVID-19 to know what to look for when the patient is say presenting to us in the convalescent period, because some of the manifestations can occur in the convalescent period as well. Need not occur during the acute phase. Even after discharge, some complications can occur. So we know that the multi-system manifestations occurring in COVID-19 is due to the expression of ACE2 receptor in the multiple tissue systems. For example, we know it's not only in the type 2 pneumocytes that the ACE2 is present. It is there in the endothelium, it is there in the blood-brain barrier, in the myocardium, in the gastrointestinal tract, in the nephrons, in the hepatobiliary system, etc. So wherever this ACE2 is present, so the virus, this thing can the spike protein can bind to that, and multitude of manifestations can occur. So we need to be careful about this thromboembolism. We know that this COVID-19 is basically a viral bronchopneumonia with thrombo inflammation. So thromboinflammation is there, and patients can manifest as a deep vein thrombosis, a pulmonary embolism, mesenteric ischemia, so stroke syndromes, myocardial infarction, and all those things. And this can actually occur in the convalescent period as well, and we need to be on the lookout for that. Some patients after discharge are presented with back with acute coronary syndrome, acute stroke syndromes, etc. And one patient actually did come out with a dry gangrene. It was a thrombus, and we had to go for an AK amputation like that. So we need to be on the lookout for thromboembolic complications in the post-COVID period as well. So that is after recovery as well. Now coming to the cardiac manifestations, it can occur along with the acute COVID-19 infection, and also it can occur after the discharge of the patient, because the ACE2 is present in the myocardium. Patient can have a subtle myocarditis which can progress to the cardiac failure, and also patients can have multitude of arrhythmias. So one important aspect is that majority of the patient, the doctors who are treated this COVID-19 knows that it's very difficult to control the blood sugar levels. Even in those patients who have been euglycemic prior to diagnosis of COVID-19, after diagnosis, some of them, the blood sugars have become uncontrollable. So this is because of the presence of these ACE2 receptors as well as the co-receptor, that is the serine protein ACE2 receptor in the pancreatic beta cells, leading to downregulation of the insulin secretion, and there is an insulin resistance as well. And this lack of control in the glycemic status can extend into the convalescent period, and we need to meticulously monitor the blood sugars to maintain it at around 180. So many dermatological manifestations can occur in COVID-19. All sorts of dermatological manifestations can occur even during the recovery period. Some patients do complaining of this urticarial lesions or the scaling in the palms and sores and all those stuff. Coming to the neurological aspect, the ACE2 is present in the blood-brain barrier. Also, you can have the spread of the virus into the brain. So it's basically a neurotropic virus through the olfactory tract, one of the reasons for this anosmia. And patients can have stroke syndromes as well as demyelinating disorders like ADAM or Guillain-Barré syndrome as part of this COVID-19, which can occur in the convalescent phase as well. Usually the renal, hepatic, and gastrointestinal manifestations occur during the acute phase, not in the post-COVID phase. So now coming to the symptomatology in acute post-COVID syndrome. So this is from one study from USA, which shows that majority did have fatigability followed by cough, shortness of breath, then loss of taste or smell, headache, body aches, diarrhea, nausea, chest or abdominal pain, confusion, etc. So some of them do appear to be pretty non-specific, but some of them we need to pay attention to, like say shortness of breath, and we will focus on that. This another study which showed that around 28% had this impairment in concentration, around 30% had this sleep disorders, around 34% memory loss, 42% exertional dyspnea, and 55% had this fatigability. So we have a cohort of around 550 patients, healthcare workers in Trivandrum Medical College, and we are following them up. And these are our observations too. So some of them do have this problem in having a very good quality sleep. The impaired concentration is there at least for 1 to 1.5 months, especially in females. And we observed that even though the severity of COVID-19 is more in males, and the mortality is also more common in males, the post-COVID syndrome is actually more commonly observed in females, and this observation has been made from across the world as well. So, and they are having this impairment in concentration, something which is referred to as a brain fading or brain fogging, means that maybe after, say, even after 1 to 2 months, they are having difficulty in focusing, and they are having this short-term memory loss and all those stuff. And these are the manifestations in various systems, the cardiovascular system. So we need to ask for palpitation, whether palpitation is persisting even after discharge, because it could be, give a clue to us, myocarditis or say cardiomyopathy or cardiac failure. So respiratory system, the exertional dyspnea, it could be due to involvement of the lung. It could due to fibrosis. Fibrosis usually occur as a part of the healing. So the bronchopneumonia, ground glassing, when they heal, some areas of fibrosis may be there, and it can lead to pulmonary artery hypertension as well as pulmonary artery embolism. Now, nervous system, we know it's a neurotropic virus, so many manifestations have been described. One is this persisting anosmia. For certain patients, especially females, this anosmia do persist for weeks to months. Then stroke syndromes, short-term memory loss, reduced attention span, confusion, poor quality of sleep, cognitive impairment, and cognitive blunting. That is what is referred to as this brain fogging. So this is actually pretty common. So you try talking to people who have recovered from COVID-19, say within 1 month or so, and ask them whether they are confused and all. This is referred to as a brain fogging or brain blunting or cognitive blunting. And the mental health aspect, so we know So those patients who are in isolation, they do have this anxiety issues, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and all those stuff, and that needs to be addressed. And we do have this musculoskeletal manifestations like polyarthralgia, polyarthritis, and excessive fatigability. So we need to focus on excessive fatigability. So you know that in following IMN, we have something known as a chronic fatigue syndrome, which is characterized by excessive fatigability, not only triggered by exertion, physical exertion, but mental exertion as well as emotional exertion, and usually by taking rest, so they don't return to normalcy. So this is seen in at least a subset of patients with COVID-19 also. And another important aspect is that anyone who is complaining of, say, multiple aches and pains, we may not pay that much attention to because it's not specific to COVID-19. So even after majority of the viral fevers, you do have this multiple aches and pains. But then some of our patients do complain of neuralgic pain, and we had absolutely no clue why this neuralgic pain is occurring in patients who have recovered from COVID-19. So, and this is a recent paper, it's published in the journal Pain, which shows that the ACE2 expression is there in the dorsal root ganglion as well. And this can actually explain the reason why some patients do develop this neuralgic pain. Why we need to characterize the pain? So if the patient is complaining of neuralgic pain in the say after recovery, so it is not NSAIDs that you need to use. You need to use, say, pregabalin or gabapentin like that. So another important aspect is that some of the patients do have these autonomic disturbances, postal hypotension, and all those stuff. And this can also be explained by the presence of this ACE2 receptor in the DRG. And some patients, along with anosmia and dysgeusia, there is another symptom which is described in COVID-19, which is referred to as chemesthesis, means difficulty in perception of this chemical sensation. That is usually the taste sensation, which is not so not perceived first, is likely to be the sensation of eating chilies and all, or the chemical sensation associated with mint, is due to the involvement of the nociceptors. So basically, we have an array of symptoms which can occur in the post-COVID period, or patients can present with a constellation of symptoms. And this UK National Institute of Health Research actually has pooled together all these symptoms and broadly classified them under 4 broad categories. So one is the classical post-critical illness syndrome. So we know that any patient who has been in the ICU, once they get discharged, so in order to get back to their normal homeostasis, they may take around, say, weeks to months. So that is common with almost all the tropical fever syndromes, and that is observed in COVID-19 as well. So those who have been in the ICU, so the recovery may take weeks to months. The second is the post-viral fatigue syndrome, which we have discussed. The third is the alarming one, that is the lasting organ damage. Suppose a patient is going in for pulmonary fibrosis, so the pulmonary rehabilitation, some patients may require home oxygen, some patients can develop this cardiac failure, so so on and so forth. So we need to cater to those symptoms as well. And fourth is the interesting one, very difficult to explain one, the fluctuating symptoms with slow recovery. That is, some patients will complain of this vascular headache like stuff, and we need to treat them as migraine. And then say around, say, 2 or 3 days later, they may present with plantar fasciitis like stuff. So there are fluctuating symptoms. Okay, so this has also been described in literature. This is just a video to take you through what happens to the lungs, because we know the primary target is definitely the lungs in COVID-19. So initially the red part is the areas where this bronchopneumonia ground glassing is there, and after 6 weeks you can see the islands of red. So the green means the normal lung, and even after 6 weeks or 12 weeks you are still seeing islands of red, means that there are certain areas of fibrosis. That is the lung capacity or the PFT may not normalize even after 6 weeks. So that is something which we need to know, and that is something which we need to address in the post-COVID clinics. So basically, what are the long-term health effects of other coronavirus infections? We need to know this, because so it's only, as Madam said, it may be around 9 months into COVID-19. Our experience with COVID-19 is only for around 9 months, but we do have experience with SARS as well as MERS, and the studies in SARS show that there is a persistent and significant impairment of exercise capacity, which is persisting even after 2 years in a subset of patients, and in around 5% of individuals, even after 15 years, they are having some sort of a lung function abnormality. That's even after 15 years, some patients are having a reduced FVC. It's important. And this exertional fatigability or this excessive fatigability is persisting in 40% of the people for around 3.5 years after recovering from SARS infection. So these are things that we need to keep in mind. another organ system which is actually affected as part of COVID-19 happens to be the heart. And we have discussed that ACE2 receptor is there in the myocardium, and patients can have myocarditis as well as all sorts of conduction disturbances, and cardiac failure can occur in the post-COVID the phase as well. And this is one interesting study from Germany. So which showed that they looked at 100 patients who had COVID-19, and they did a cardiac MRI 71 days after COVID-19 diagnosis, and they found that around 78% had evidence of this myocardial involvement, with ongoing myocardial inflammation 60%. So basically, this myocarditis is there in around say 70%. Now, this is actually very high numbers, probably because of the recruitment bias into the study. Whereas another study in USA showed that around 20% of those who with very mild infections, they did have this cardiac MRI abnormalities, and that was in professional athletes. This for professional athletes is very important because if they are having this subtle myocarditis, in all these patients, the echo was normal. So basically, they did not have any major problems, but they had this subtle myocarditis and subtle myocardial inflammation going on. If such patients are allowed to take part in competitive sports where the level of exertion required from them is pretty high, so it may not be safe for them. For example, we know Djokovic had this COVID-19 and he had to participate in US Open. So prior to that, this athletes need to undergo a cardiac MRI. So this is actually very important. So it may not be important for our level of exertion, but for professional athletes, it may be prudent to have a cardiac MRI prior to starting their competitive sports activities again. So this is very important. And this the presence of comorbidities, duration, severity of acute COVID-19 illness, etc., did not correlate with this finding. So even those patients with mild illness did have some sort of a cardiac MRI abnormality. So this is something which we need to keep in mind. This is basically our algorithm. Basically, when we started this post-COVID clinics, so the post-COVID clinics has been set up in almost all the PHCs, CHCs, and FHCs, and from there is sort of a telemedicine consult with the post-COVID clinics in say a district hospital or in the designated COVID facilities. So basically, we don't want all the patients who are recovered from COVID-19 to come and crowd into our post-COVID clinic. So we need to handpick patients with red flag signs. We want to have them only in our post-COVID clinics. Otherwise, our post-COVID clinics may turn out to be epicenters for further infection and spread. So what we need to focus on is those patients with exertional dyspnea. So exertional dyspnea could be due to anemia, or it could be due to a respiratory problem like fibrosis or embolism, or it could be due to a cardiological issue, cardiovascular issue, myocarditis, LV systolic, diastolic dysfunction, or cardiomyopathy. So basically, we need to handpick those patients with exertional dyspnea, and we need to do focus investigations like hemogram, CRP, D-dimer, elevated D-dimer to give us a clue, then PFT, X-ray, CT chest, echocardiography, and if D-dimer is elevated until then through investigations we have not identified a cause for exertional dyspnea, so we need to consider a CT pulmonary angiogram. So, and our experience is that the state protocol says that those patients during hospitalization or in home care, along with this resting saturation, we need to go for a 6-minute walk test or a 40-step test and look for exertional desaturation. That's pretty important. But our observation is that some of the patients after discharge from the hospital, when they go back to their homes and start climbing stairs and all, they develop this exertional desaturation. This is actually very, very, very important. So even with 6-minute walk test or say 40-step test, we are not able to identify this subset of patients. And till now, we have been focusing on certain things which probably may be common to many of the viral illnesses. But then there are certain things which are unique to COVID-19. Okay, you can say that anosmia without upper respiratory signs is probably unique to COVID-19. Like that, MISC as well as MASA is unique to COVID-19. That is multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children and multi-system inflammatory syndrome in adult. So this is actually a hyperinflammatory response to the SARS-CoV-2 infection. So probably this infection occurred maybe around say 3 weeks prior to the manifestation of MISC or MASA. So that could be like a diagnosed infection, or it could be an asymptomatic infection. And a patient may be presenting to you with MISC or MASC. MASC, no one will miss because all the pediatricians in the States are aware of what MISC is, how to handpick them, and all those things we know. So in children, COVID-19 is a very mild illness. The only thing is that some of the children can present as MISC, and they need to be handpicked, identified. It is like an atypical Kawasaki. So probably the treatment is IVIG or steroids. So I don't think any of the pediatricians will miss MISC. So what the physicians are likely to miss MISA if you are not aware of this thing. So less than 21 years, it is MISC. More than 21 years, it is MISA. MISC is rare and MISA is extremely rare in Trivandrum. So we have had around say 5 cases of MISA till now. That is multisystem inflammatory syndrome in adults and around 15 cases of MISC. So I will take you through a case of MISA. It's a 23-year-old male, fever, fatiguability of 3 days duration, present with features of hepatitis as well as acute kidney injury, had myocarditis, was in hypotension, saturation was sort of maintained. And for all patients who are attending our casualty, we do a rapid antigen test, and if it is negative, we do proceed with a NAT. Both were negative. And if you look at the investigations were suggestive of a septic shock. The total count 25,000 with neutrophilia, thrombocytopenia, CRP very much elevated. The ferritin is more than 10,000. The D-dimer is more than 10 microgram per liter. Procal is more than 100. And the IL-6, we do have access to IL-6, is pretty much elevated. We need to rule out other things like a tropical fever or Weil syndrome, negative, blood culture and echo, everything was negative. And the NT-proBNP was very high, suggestive of myocarditis. So anyone will diagnose a septic shock in this patient. There is no doubt about that. But the problem is, so why should a 23-year-old, so it's an immunocompetent patient develop septic shock? So usually in septic shock, we need to have a source of sepsis, like a skin and soft tissue, a foci has to be there, or a bone joint, or a pulmonary foci, or a gastrointestinal, or a genitourinary foci. If there is nothing is, a foci is there, you have to consider inflammatory states as well. So probably now comes the difficulty in diagnosing MISA. So MISA is it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So these are the DDs we will entertain in this case, a tropical fever syndrome like say lepto, septic shock, infective endocarditis or MISA. So we will miss out MISA if we are not considering it as one of the DDs. So Kerala is actually in the peaking or say in the plateauing phase. So usually it is during the plateauing phase that we get to see these hyperinflammatory syndromes. So this is actually the case definition of MISA, which is given in our protocol. Because if you search the literature, there is enough and more literature on MISC, but very sparse literature on MISA. And this is the working case definition of MISA, and severe illness requiring hospitalization in a person above 21 years. It is less than 21 years, it will come under the category of MISC. A positive test result of current or previous SARS-CoV-2 infection. So it could be a RAT positivity or a PCR positivity or an antibody positivity. So it could be a current infection or an infection in the previous 12 weeks. So this is very, very important. In our case, the antigen was negative, the PCR was negative, but we did a SARS-CoV-2 IgG antibody, it was highly positive. So basically it was an infection which the patient did not know, which occurred around say 3 weeks back. The average time at which the hyperinflammatory response occurs is around 25 days after the onset of SARS-CoV-2 infection, and say that inciting infection could be asymptomatic or a mild thing which the patient may not be aware of, that, as in what happened in our case. So it is only through an antibody test that we can diagnose this condition if this RAT or this PCR is negative. And the third criteria is the dysfunction of one or more extrapulmonary organ system. In our case, we had this myocarditis, we had this acute kidney injury and hepatitis. Okay. And the most important thing is then you can always say that in severe SARS-CoV-2 infection also all these organ systems will be affected. So basically the difference between a severe SARS-CoV-2 infection and a MISA is that in MISA the pneumonia is actually not very much prominent. So lung may be spared. The patient is having dyspnea because of myocarditis. Whereas in severe COVID-19 we know that it is pneumonia with other organ system involvement. Whereas in MISA it is not pneumonia. So it's basically myocarditis and other organ system involvement. And the fourth criteria is lab evidence of severe inflammation like CRP, ferritin, D-dimer, IL-6 and all. And why these procal levels were more than 100? Isn't it suggestive of a septic shock? So procal levels can also be elevated in MISA as part of an inflammatory response. And the fifth one is an absence of a severe respiratory illness or lung involvement. And the sixth one is the most important or the most difficult aspect. It is actually a diagnosis of exclusion. We need to rule out tropical fever syndromes. We need to do infective endocarditis. We need to rule out autoimmune conditions like SLE or vasculitis. So this is the algorithm in case of MISC, which almost all the pediatricians are very, very much familiar with. So a child with fever with more than 2 system involvement. So MISC diagnosis is not a major concern in Kerala because all the pediatricians are aware of it. Whereas MISA can be diagnosed only if we keep our eyes open to atypical manifestations of COVID-19. And if the PCR or antigen is negative, and if a patient is coming to you like this, we need to get an antibody done. So this is one of the indications where you can consider antibody testing in Kerala to diagnose MISA. Okay. This is important because the treatment of MISA is high dose of steroids, and if the patient is not responding, IVIG. High dose of steroids means, in this case, we used methylprednisolone 1.5 milligram loading, 1.5 gram loading followed by 1 gram for 3 days, and then we use high dose of steroids as follow-up. In pediatrics, it's more of IVIG to begin with, and then steroids. And now we know that any patient who is coming with these sort of manifestations, definitely we need to look for SARS-CoV-2 infection. Patients with multi-vessel, large vessel stroke, Kawasaki-like illness, multi-system inflammatory syndrome, hyperinflammatory shock. This hyperinflammatory shock and is the one which we are discussing. There's a MISA. The toxic shock syndrome like illness in children, acute MI, GBS, viral encephalitis, ADAM, and all those things. So anyone who is coming with any sort of atypical manifestation during this period, the patient need not be from a cluster containment zone. You can consider the entire Kerala as a cluster containment zone. You need to consider SARS-CoV-2 infection as well. And this is the telemedicine platform for stratification to avoid crowding in the post-COVID clinics. So a post-COVID patient, so we need to look at the red flag signs. We don't want all the patients. We don't want the patient with lack of sleep, etc., to come and crowd our clinics. We are focusing on the red flag signs like, say, dyspnea, palpitation, chest pain, unilateral pedal edema, and syncope. So unilateral pedal edema is to identify DVT. And they will come to these patients through some sort of a mechanism. Will be screened, and only these patients with red flag signs will come to the clinics in PHC, CHC, and FHC. And from there, if they're having any doubts, they will consult with the clinicians in the higher levels and this through a telemedicine platform. And if needed, will be referred to secondary care centers or tertiary care centers. That's the postcode clinics there. And this is how the patients will be analyzed. So basically, our focus is on identifying those patients with exertional dyspnea and to see whether they are having a cardiological or a respiratory problem. And now, what about the treatment of this post-COVID syndrome? It depends on the diagnosis, definitely. So if the patient is having a pulmonary fibrosis, the patients will require this pulmonary rehabilitation. And majority of the patients who require oxygen during hospital stay, the pulmonary rehabilitation will have to start in the hospital itself prior to discharge of these patients. And then antifibrotics that we leave to the pulmonologist. So if the fibrosis is present, so they can start on pirfenidone or nintedanib based on their own criteria. So we do have access to nintedanib now, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. The cost is around 4,500 rupees per month. And when we are using new drugs like nintedanib, we need to be careful about the drug-drug interaction with oral anticoagulants. And then the anticoagulants. So basically, the focus is always on the occurrence of, say, pulmonary embolism. So we had a resident who developed this DVT after, not DVT, pulmonary embolism after discharge. So these sort of things may not be common, but it does occur in the susceptible individual. So anticoagulants, at least in some patients, we may have to continue for, say, 3 weeks to 1 month after discharge. Okay, so there is no definite guidelines which say that, no, we need to continue anticoagulants after discharge. So there is no definite guidelines. So we know that hypoxemic individuals, those with elevated D-dimer, definitely they require prophylactic anticoagulation during hospital stay. And those patients with DVT or pulmonary embolism during hospital stay require therapeutic anticoagulation. Those patients with very much elevated D-dimer levels require therapeutic anticoagulation. So what about post-discharge anticoagulation? In those patients who have received therapeutic anticoagulation for pulmonary embolism or DVT, definitely will continue for 3 to 6 months. But what about other patients? So we need to look at the risk stratification. So age above 75, plus this venous thromboembolism score is there. There's IMPROVE VTE score. So IMPROVE VTE score, if it is more than 4, the patients will benefit from anticoagulation for around, say, around 3 weeks. So if the IMPROVE VTE score is more than 2 or equal to 2, plus if the D-dimer level is more than twice that of the baseline, that is D-dimer is more than 1, then also we can consider anticoagulation for around, say, 2 to 3 weeks. So what is anticoagulation coagulant we prefer after discharge, on discharge? So it can be apixaban or rivaroxaban. Now coming to cardiac failure. So if you diagnose, suppose someone is presenting you with exertional dyspnea, and if you're diagnosing, say, cardiac failure, definitely the treatment is as per the standard treatment for cardiac failure. Now coming to what will you do for chronic fatigue syndrome. So we know chronic fatigue syndrome definitely does not have any a specific treatment as such. But what have been tried is omega-3 fatty acids, so vitamin D, vitamin E, etc. And we do try that. And if you think that the pain the patient is complaining about is the neuralgic pain, definitely patient will improve with amitriptyline or gabapentin. And some patients do have this migrainous headache which occur during the after discharge or the post-COVID period. So we treat as just like the usual treatment for migraine. And this is something which is very, very important. There's a pulmonary rehabilitation in those patients who are having this persisting exertional dyspnea. We need to focus on pulmonary rehabilitation. And the state, the guideline do mention about the exercises to be done after discharge. So, and you can go through all those things. That is in the post-COVID clinic, the guidelines, a 28-page document. So the breathing control exercises, as well as, how to use incentive spirometry, how to go for a graded exercise program and all those things, and how to do it. All those things are clearly described in our guideline. The most important thing is we don't want the patients to rush back to their usual activities. They should take their own time. So we don't want to be sedentary as well. So probably the graded exercise program has to be initiated. So thank you very much. I am Desinath for this opportunity to interact with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew. Thank you, Dr. Arvind, for an excellent presentation, very crisp, touching all the points. And many of our members who have participated have so many doubts. All of you may please put your queries in the chat box. Over to Sandhya.
Okay, sir, that was an excellent presentation. I think you have made it very simple and everybody was able to understand the things. One of the most important thing that everybody must have noticed is that right now we are doing the RIT on the 10th day. And even our neighboring states are discharging the patients on the 10th day without doing the RAT. So large hue and cry is going on, so that and we all know right now the recovery rate is also 82%. But you have pointed out the one fact, one very most important fact: don't rely on RAT alone. You just look at the clinical stability of the patient, because after the 7th day this storm, cytokine storm can occur. So that is one, and so antigen will be anyway negative. So that is a very important point that everybody must have noted. And also one interesting fact that most of the people reporting are females, but most of the affected cases are usually males. And even last time when we did the death audit, one of the interesting findings we have noted is like 64% is the male and 36% is female. And mostly 60% of the people had hypertension and diabetes mellitus, and 30% have diabetes mellitus, hypertension and CAD, and 10% has diabetes mellitus and hypertension. So DM is a common finding in most of the cases. And then there is the problem of hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia that can occur in the post-COVID phase also. So what I feel is that in the end, like during the history taking, for all these symptoms, we have to keep in one mind whether are you from the cluster area or are you from the, have you tested positive by any of the methods in the past 3 months or 4 months, like that. So with these words, I think we will go for the, we will be open for the question answer session. Many people have posted their doubts in it. And I think the first question is, like COVID patients are tested RAT, that is sent by the Srikumar sir on 10th day and discharges if negative. They report to some other hospital with breathlessness and saturation fall on the same day or next day. Can we admit such patients in non-COVID wards, or can we consider them as true negative? Can they spread the infection? Over to you, sir. Arvind sir.
Okay, madam. The thing is, after discharge, maybe the patient is discharged on the 10th day antigen negative. On the 11th day, the patient is coming back with dyspnea. Can the patient be admitted in the COVID pool or the non-COVID pool? We actually do admit the patient in the COVID pool. If the patient is coming back within 7 days after discharge, that is what the state guidelines say. That is even after discharge for the next 7 days, you are in a limited isolation at home. No? So if the patient is coming back to you in that phase, we do admit the patient in the COVID area. If the patient is coming after 7 days, then we admit it in the non-COVID pool. Basically, it is a continuum. That is the most important thing. Such a patient should not have been discharged. That is the take-home message from the talk is that don't rely on the RAT. We know the patients want the RAT to be done, and once they are negative, they will compel us to discharge the patient. Don't rely on RAT. Just convey that there has to be clinical stability also. That is a very, very important aspect. And some of the questions that I did see, one is in pulmonary embolism. So will you consider, say, lifelong anticoagulation? So in pulmonary embolism, we know that basically around, say, 6 months of anticoagulation. So lifelong anticoagulation is for those with thrombophilias. Like suppose we are identifying a protein C deficiency, protein S deficiency, antithrombin 3 deficiency, factor V Leiden mutation, or a prothrombin gene mutations, etc. In such a scenario, if there is a thrombophilic scenario, then it is a lifelong anticoagulation. In other situations, it is around 6 months of anticoagulation. Second is, can aspirin be substituted for those, we are using apixaban or rivaroxaban in those patients who require anticoagulation. We are not using warfarin because we don't have enough data on warfarin. So if it is for a therapeutic anticoagulation, say embolism or say DVT, definitely we'll use warfarin. Yeah, if we want to continue prophylactic anticoagulation, we want to use safer drugs like apixaban or rivaroxaban. But in patients may not be able to afford it. It costs around say 1,500 rupees for say 2-week course. And then can we substitute it with the ecosprin, aspirin? As of now, we don't have evidence. But one important aspect is that now recovery trial is actually an ongoing trial, the recovery trial. So now they have included an aspirin arm also. They have included an aspirin arm. So it is not for a post-COVID like scenario. As a part of treatment, they are trying whether the addition of aspirin to our anticoagulation will benefit the patient. So basically it is being tried out. And what I would like to say is that even if it is not written in our guidelines, because we can't say just write aspirin in our guidelines without evidence as of now. But if our patients can't afford apixaban or rivaroxaban, rather than sending them without anything, it will be better to give aspirin. But the problem is that what we are expecting is a thrombosis. No? So like a DVT, etc. Whether aspirin will prevent that, we don't know basically. But then it will be better to use aspirin if the patients are not able to afford apixaban or rivaroxaban. How is methylprednisolone administered in divided doses or as a single dose infusion? So we are actually using methylprednisolone as divided doses. So dexamethasone or methylprednisolone both can be used. Okay, so dexamethasone is actually having more anti-inflammatory effect than methylprednisolone, and the recovery trial was done using dexamethasone. So usually we do prefer dexamethasone. Methylprednisolone is a very good alternative. So methylprednisolone is given as BD dosage. Dexamethasone is given as an OD dosage. In pregnancy, if those patients require steroids during pregnancy, that is a difficult situation because you know that dexamethasone and betamethasone will cross the placenta. So usually for fetal maturation, we are using dexamethasone or betamethasone. But we need to give steroids for around 7 to 10 days. Now, for a maturation of the fetal, this thing, lung and all, we require only 1 to 2 doses of steroids. So if you are using, say, dexamethasone, the problem will be that there is a chance that the fetal adrenal suppression can occur with this thing. So it will be better to use steroids like, say, hydrocortisone or say, Visalon or methylprednisolone in pregnancy, because the 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 2 enzyme in the placenta will inactivate these steroids, but it won't inactivate dexamethasone. So if it is nearing term and probably you may have to terminate the pregnancy, then you give dexamethasone 2 doses and then switch over to methylprednisolone. That is, fetal maturation is also assured. For asymptomatic antenatal cases, is it necessary to prescribe any drugs? No. The problem, we know that we are trying to correct that since our pregnancy patients comes under category B. Naturally, there is a tendency to start antivirals, even though we know that none of the antivirals do have any benefit as of now. So what we do is that we focus more on steroids and anticoagulants. We need to focus on that. We need to forget this antiviral part in pregnancy. So majority of the pregnant ladies are not having fever or anything, so there is no need for them. But then the D-dimer levels are elevated as part of normal pregnancy. We know that the usual cutoffs are different in pregnancy. In the first trimester, it may be as high as say 800 nanogram. If you're using nanogram per ml, so it could be as high as 800 nanogram. So usual adult normal will be less than 500 nanogram. So in first trimester, it could be as high as 800. Second trimester, it could be as high as 1.2, so 1,200 nanogram. Or third trimester, it could be as high as say 2,000. So this is important. So we need to have higher threshold for therapeutic anticoagulation pregnancy. When is the first follow-up after discharge plan? If the patient has exertional dyspnea in first visit itself, should we do all the workup? So basically, if the patient is having exertional dyspnea and if you don't have an answer why the exertional dyspnea is occurring, we need to have a workup. Usually the first visit, If the patient has been discharged in a very stable state, probably you can go for a telephonic consult or say a telemedicine platform, or else it is after 2 weeks. Can we give hydroxychloroquine to lactating mothers? There is no harm in giving hydroxychloroquine to lactating mothers. If you can avoid hydroxychloroquine, that will be the best thing to do. So we know we don't have enough evidence to support the use of hydroxychloroquine in any patient populations. Basically, a risk versus benefit sort of thing. We know that the risk of hydroxychloroquine is not very high. That is why we are actually persisting with the hydroxychloroquine. National protocol also insists on giving hydroxychloroquine, but pretty early in the disease course. Once the hypoxia is occurring, then there is no point in giving hydroxychloroquine. So in pregnancy and lactating mothers, probably if we can avoid unnecessary use of antivirals, it will be pretty good. If a category C patient's condition improves, so is otherwise normal, can he be reversed to category A or category B? That's a clinical decision that you can make, no problem. What is the significance of unilateral lymphedema in post-COVID-19 case? Basically, when we are framing this red flag signs, it is actually not aimed at a seasoned physician. So it's aimed at very young doctors or say JPHN or ASHA who may be doing their stratification. So unilateral edema is actually DVT. Okay, so it is aimed at picking DVT, nothing else. Then what is the logic mechanism of unilateral manifestation in a systemic pathology? I think it's clear now. Unilateral manifestation is DVT. So in pedal edema, bilateral will be pretty happy. Unilateral pedal edema will be much worried. That's it. Is favipiravir safe in lactating mothers? Definitely, favipiravir has a contraindication in lactating mothers as well as in pregnant ladies. And if you are contemplating using favipiravir in a female in the reproductive age group, better do a UPT to rule out pregnancy. Came to know that many patients, even without hypoxia, are getting remdesivir. Is it really required? You know that it is not really required. So remdesivir, if it is being used, it has to be used only in patients who are having hypoxia, who are requiring low flow oxygen. So in those patients with high flow nasal oxygen, those on HFNO, NIV, mechanical ventilation, there is no advantage in using remdesivir. So our probably our protocol is going to be revised in a week's time, which will clearly say that remdesivir use has to be done only in those patients who are requiring low flow oxygen. Should we start enoxaparin in asymptomatic pregnant women based on D-dimer levels? What should be the cutoff levels to start with? So in pregnancy, we need to be a bit more cautious. Okay, so basically, because the pregnancy by itself is a prothrombotic condition. So in pregnancy, we have to go for prophylactic anticoagulation. So all the admitted pregnant ladies, so definitely deserve prophylactic anticoagulation. And if the dose of anticoagulation need to be increased, that is based on the D-dimer levels. Usually we go for OD dosing, and if it is said D-dimer is more than 5 times the upper limit of normal, only then we go for a therapeutic anticoagulation. Having said this, the interesting paradox in pregnancy is that we know if you are going to the RCOG, the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology guidelines and all, even in the absence of COVID-19, they say that pregnant ladies might benefit from anticoagulation, and they have listed so many host factors like say BMI more than 35, say multiparity, twins, and all those stuff, those on progesterone and all. And then we think that when these patients are having COVID-19, which is a condition which is associated with thromboinflammation, the chance of this thing, micro and macrovascular thrombosis in the pregnant ladies must be pretty higher than the general population, no? But that is actually not being observed. But anyway, still it will be better to use anticoagulation in pregnancy if there is an indication for the same. Not for all the admitted patients. Based on your D-dimer levels, go for anticoagulation. What is the maximum dose of dexamethasone we can use? Actually, our guidelines say 0.4, but then the thing is that the patients are not improving. We know that antivirals are not going to help you. Once the patient is having hypoxemia, who is recurring HFNO and all, there is no antiviral which can say reverse this thing. Only the immunomodulators may help you. So probably you may have to individualize the dose of dexamethasone. Guidelines say that the max dose probably is going to be 0.4 mg per kg. Do all the admitted patients require prophylactic anticoagulation? Definitely not. So the prophylactic anticoagulation is given to those patients who are having hypoxemia, it's respiratory, the SpO2 less than 94% in room air, or the SIC score should be more than 4. Especially, so usually this for those with hypoxia, or based on the D-dimer cutoffs. So those with hypoxia, we start prophylactic anticoagulation. Based on the D-dimer levels, we decide whether they require prophylactic or therapeutic anticoagulation. how effective is favipiravir in mild to moderate case? Do we need to use it? So definitely, I won't say that we should be using favipiravir for mild or moderate case, because it's not for mild case. Probably we don't require favipiravir. So for moderate case, we don't have evidence apart from the Russian study. Russia, they did a study in moderate case for avifavir, but then the study population was only around 68 cases. So we don't have enough evidence to use favipiravir in the moderate cases. Then why do the state guidelines say that in category C you can go with favipiravir? Basically, the mechanism of action of favipiravir is same as that of remdesivir, RDRB inhibition. So basically, that was written in the state guidelines to prevent the abuse of favipiravir in the mild category of patients. We don't want favipiravir to be used for asymptomatic patients or mild category of patients. You can consider using favipiravir in patients who really are severe when remdesivir is not available or not accessible. So should we taper steroid or stop it abruptly? We don't have any guidelines. So usually they said 7 to 10 days of steroid should be used. What we usually do is that those patients with this bronchopneumonia, CT evidence of pneumonia and all, so we don't stop steroids abruptly. We continue it for say 7 days or 14 days. Usually switch over to methylprednisolone, so 8 milligram 101 for say 7 days, followed by 4 milligram 101 for 7 days. We can't generalize it, but we usually take is an individualized decision. Is a 6-minute walk test a reasonable alternative to pulmonary function test? So definitely, the thing is that it's not easy to convince a pulmonologist to do a PFT when the patient is having active disease. So we are doing this 6-minute walk test when the patient is admitted. So that question is, no one will do PFT. But then once the patient is, we have declared the patient as, cured. So, and they completed 7 days of isolation, then they can be taken up for PFT. If we see GGO or can we give steroids? So why we are using steroids means that probably the only drug which can prevent the progression of this downglassing to fibrosis is steroids. But it is as you all know, it is a double-edged weapon. So GGO with exertional dyspnea, probably go for steroids. In MISA, a high dose of methylprednisolone is given. Is this also given as a divided dose? So this is actually not given as a divided dose. It is given as an infusion. Case of reinfection reporting, is there any statistics available regarding the chance of reinfection, need for hospitalization, etc.? So we don't have the national statistics. The most interesting aspect is that if you want to have a bird's eye view of about reinfection, the best available document will be the ECDC, European CDC guideline. Interesting thing is that they have cases only from 6 countries, which includes India. That means that in order to brand a patient as having reinfection is not very, very easy. Because of one reason, you need to have the preserved PCR samples of the initial infection also. Then you need to do the genomic sequence. Only if the genomic sequence is different, we can say that it is a reinfection. So as of now, we don't know whether reinfection is a major problem. Only thing is we know reinfection is a reality, but we have say crores of cases, and then the reinfection cases are actually a minuscule or a handful. So we need not be that much worried about reinfection. But then once you are getting infected, you cannot lower your guard. You need to continue your masking as well as hand sanitization. We had around say 3 cases of reinfection till now in Trivandrum Medical College, and we are awaiting the genomic sequencing data. And only thing we need to be worried about is that is the second infection going to be severe than the first infection, like in dengue. That is why we are very much concerned in dengue. The secondary dengue is going to be fatal like that. But this antibody dependent enhancement has not been described in COVID-19 till now. Of the reported cases, means in ECDC, out of around 6 cases, around 2 cases, the second infection was more severe than the first infection. Suppose the first infection was asymptomatic or say mild, then second infection, whatever be the symptoms, it will be severe only. It's not that the second infection, the patient will end up in ventilator. So that is not being observed. Patient posted for early CABG tested positive for COVID-19. If so, what is the ideal timing for CABG once the patient is negative? So basically CABG, you need to discuss with the cardiothoracic surgeon, needing the emergency nature of the procedure. So if we are able to say postpone the surgery for say around 3 weeks, it will be fine. But if it is an emergency surgery, we need to explain in detail with the patient why we are postponing surgeries, because the course of COVID-19 or the prognosis in COVID-19, patients who undergo surgery is not actually very, very good. So we need to explain everything to them. But if it is a bleeding aneurysm, the risk versus benefit of doing the surgery at that point of time is definitely going to be much, much more than the risk of dying due to COVID-19, and probably we have to go with surgery. That is why we need to discuss with the surgeon regarding the urgency of the case. Is there any role for antiviral beyond 10 days? There is no need. So after 10 days, you are not going to have viral replication. So your antivirals are not going to work. Pirfenidone, how long to be given? I don't know the answer for that. What we plan to do is to keep all these patients under pulmonology follow-up, and they will be doing the FVC, and based on the FVC, they will adjust the dose of the drugs as well as the duration of the drugs. Post-COVID person now admitted in ICU in a secondary care unit has left lung, lower lobe consolidation with comorbidities of diabetes, OSA, hypertension, obesity. Condition is stable. Now, is there a need to shift to a tertiary care unit? Depends on your level of confidence and the faith the bystanders or the patients have in you. So all centers, I believe, in Kerala are capable of taking care of any sorts of patient, provided you do have a ventilator backup. So you can continue treating the patient in your center. 10 days. Abdominal manifestations of post-COVID syndrome. So we had one patient with mesenteric ischemia. So if you can consider it as an abdominal manifestation, so it is basically not an abdominal manifestation. I can say it's a mesenteric ischemia. And since you asked that question, the MISC as well as MISA, the common manifestation is going to be abdominal pain, diarrhea, and vomiting. So it's going to be a GI-like manifestation in MISA as well as MISC. So I will take you through a case of a 60-year-old female. Probably that will be the oldest reported case of MISA in literature. We have not reported it. We'll plan to report it. A 60-year-old lady present with acute abdomen, like a fever and acute abdominal pain and in shock, and had to be intubated, ventilated, was on inotropic support, and then the CT means came as an inflamed appendix, and our surgery HOD definitely said that it is not due to this appendix. No, with this soft abdomen, nothing, no guarding, no rigidity, nothing. You can't have this septic shock. So that made us think about other things, and the patient was in multi-organ dysfunction, and the CRP and all those stuff were pretty much elevated. The D-dimer was more than 10, and then we thought about this inflammatory process, and this antibody was sent, and antigen was negative. The PCR was awaited, antibody was sent, and antibody came as positive, highly positive, and we started around steroids, and we were able to taper the inotropes, and we were able to wean her off ventilator. And then the PCR also came as positive. Probably the PCR is a shedding only. The PCR positivity does not mean that it is an acute infection, such a scenario when the IgG levels are very much elevated. So it's probably an RNA shedding. What I'm trying to convey is that for all cases of this septic shock-like manifestation, you need to keep a MISA in the back of your mind. You should not jump to the conclusion that is MISA. You try to rule out other conditions and you consider MISA as well. So that will be the abdominal manifestations of post-COVID syndrome. I think I'm done with almost all the questions. Others, I think you can ask me. So if there are any clarifications required.
Any other clinical clarifications needed, you can ask right now. Dr. Arvind, what I feel is that like you have conducted many sessions on post-COVID syndrome, and many clinical queries have come. If we could release like a booklet from the state on FAQs, that will be useful for the practicing physicians.
Definitely we'll do that. Actually, we are in touch with Dr. Divya, NHM training division. So initially we are focusing on more on the patients. We would like to give videos on how to do this pulmonary rehabilitation at home and how to do this graded exercise so that we can avoid crowding in the post-COVID clinics. And regarding doctors also, we can go with FAQs. No harm in that.
Any queries?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sandhya, Dr. Arvind. Excellent presentation. And also, you answered each and every question very well. And anybody who want his number, you can collect from us, so that the queries in the queries won't end in this case, because it is ongoing and we are going on, research is going on. So any questions coming in your practice and all, you can call and ask him. Any doubt regarding the management, anything to move forward. Okay, thank you. Once again, a very big thank you, Dr. Arvind. Taking so much patience to answer each and every question very well.